to open and close all of our gatherings with these words. At the very end there, I said, Squidilhege, I ask you to forgive me, Elhua. I've recently learned to form these words, and it's neat for me because I've heard some of our most advanced speakers, Howard Elijah, one of the now late elders at our longhouse, would sometimes share a 20, 30, 40-minute opening, and then he would still say that I've just recently learned to share the Thanksgiving address, and please forgive me. So as someone that's on my language learning journey, learning these words and then thinking about how our elders and our master speakers are always bringing that humility, that it's so important to place ourselves. And so my understanding of the context of the Thanksgiving address and why we should try to start and end our events with it is that it's good to place ourselves in the context of the universe and to remember that the universe is vast. We start out by thinking ourselves and by thinking people, and then we work up to bigger and bigger and bigger ideas until eventually we actually, one of the last things we think is Docksteader, we think those stars. And to me, it's always profound that we can look up with our naked eye and look at a star up in the sky, and if it's a million light years away, we're able with our minds to conjure something that happened a million years ago just by looking up. So it reminds me of just the power that our minds have and how important it is to recognize our place in the world. So before we depart today, I will ask for the honor to also offer some closing words for our Thanksgiving address to help put us in a place of what you feel.
Thank you so much, Karl. I will now call upon my other lab members, Jasmine and Arena, who are going to come up and introduce the panelists for this evening's event.
Can folks hear us in the back? It's loud enough in the back? Yeah. Lisa? Medium? Okay. We'll come check that out in a sec. Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Jasmine. I'm a graduate student at the Indigenous Literatures Lab, and I'm super happy to be introducing a couple of our really outstanding panelists today. The first is Alicia Elliott. Alicia is an award-winning Mohawk writer and editor living in Brantford, Ontario. She's written for the Globe and Mail, CBC, Hazlitt, and many others. Elliott's first book, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, was a national bestseller and was chosen as a best book by the Globe and Mail, Quill and Quire, and Chatelaine, and was shortlisted for the Hilary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. Her second book, the novel And Then She Fell, was published in the fall of 2023. It was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction and went on to win the Amazon First Novel Award, the Indigenous Voices Award for Prose and English, and the First Nations Community Reads Award.
I have the honor of introducing Dr. Kevin White. So Dr. Kevin White, Akwesasne Mohawk, is an assistant professor of Indigenous Studies and Religion at the University of Toronto, whose work focuses primarily on Haudenosaunee creation story, history, and culture. White scholarship champions Tuscarora ethnographer J.N.B. Hewitt's work on Iroquois cosmologies. Guided by community, cultural values, and Haudenosaunee lens of analysis, White seeks to repatriate epistemological knowledge contained in texts by Hewitt and others. White is working with Six Nations, Grand River Community on Deskahay Project in Wa Story Collection, and received 2 Jacqueline Humanities Institute Scholarship Scholar in Residence Awards for a collaboration between undergraduate students and Grand River on Haudenosaunee diplomacy and history.
And Dr. Sara General. Dr. Sara General is Mohawk Nation, Turtle Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River, where she lives with her husband and 3 children. She's an assistant professor of Indigenous Studies at United College and at the University of Waterloo. Sara is a writer, artist, researcher, and language learner, and recently completed a 2-year adult immersion language program at Onkawana and Yogwa. Sara also works with community organizations like the Six Nations Language Commission and Six Nations Polytechnic to support the many language revitalization efforts underway in the community. Through her company, Spirit and Intent, she makes books, art, and films that celebrate Haudenosaunee languages, stories, and knowledges.
So before we call up our panelists for today, we would like to also formally introduce our director, Dr. Jennifer Brandt, who will say a few words. So Dr. Jennifer Brandt is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She belongs to the Ganingahaga with family ties to 6 stations of the Grand River Territory and Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. Dr. Brandt was the faculty co-chair of the Indigenous Education Network for the last 3 years and was the founding director of the Indigenous Literatures Lab. Dr. Brandt teaches courses on Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous literatures, and structural and colonial violence in education. Her work on Indigenous maternal praxis has made significant contributions across the field of education, sociology, and women and gender studies. If you please help me welcome Dr. Brandt.
Sego.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sego Sewagwego, Jennifer Elliott. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to all of us. I'm so excited and delighted for this evening's conversation. I first actually met Dr. Kevin White and Sara General, Dr. Sara General, in conversation together, like with Karl back, I think in 2017, when I was the Cultural Resource Coordinator at the Niagara Regional Native Center. And yeah, just that synergy of that conversation and then reading Alicia Elliott's work, and I'm like, oh, we have to have this conversation again. So I think it probably goes without saying why I brought the 3 of you together. But I'll start by just saying, so we had a meeting a couple days ago just to sort of like talk about, some of the intentions for this evening's talk, some of the desires for this evening's talk. Alicia Elliott's first book was mentioned, So A Mind Spread Out on the Ground. And I don't know how well you can see at the back, but I wanted to show this just because I have probably like 100 stick notes in this book, like just so powerful, so moving, and described as life-changing. And then she fell. And I have two of Sara's books here. So The School That Ate Children, and this book, which I teach in my Indigenous Literatures class and have been teaching this book for a decade, Spirit and Intent, a collection of short stories and other writings. Just such a powerful book, and we'll get to hear more about it. Thinking of Dr. Kevin White's work, and again, as was mentioned in the bio, like thinking about the way these creation stories, the Haudenosaunee creation story, and like the Indigenous brilliance that is threaded throughout that creation story that has been told since time immemorial, and that we are, in these brilliant literatures, contemporary Haudenosaunee intellectual thought are still writing about today, and how going back to the Haudenosaunee creation story, the lessons that it has for contemporary realities, I think is quite profound. And I'm really interested in hearing more about that and having you all hear more about that this evening. But I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pass it over because I think we're going to open with some readings. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Alicia.
Hi, everybody. Sego. I feel so embarrassed. This happens every single time I go somewhere. I literally brought copies of my book to give out to some of the students, and then I forgot to keep one for myself. So I had to borrow Jennifer's because I realized as I was sitting here, I was like, I don't have a book to read from. So anyways, good to know that I'm just continuing my tradition of forgetting the most important thing. I'm just going to read, just because we were talking a lot about land when we did our kind of pre-meeting where we were deciding kind of what we were going to talk about. And because we're in Toronto, and this book takes place in Toronto, I wanted to kind of read this part where the main character, her name is Alice, is reflecting, I guess, on the land that is Toronto, and also this is happening while she's kind of her psychosis is kind of starting to really take hold. So basically all you need to know to set up is that she is walking down the street, pushing a stroller with her kid in it. Her baby's name is Dawn, and she was distracted, so her stroller just got tangled on a blanket of a native guy who had his blanket out, and he was selling dream catchers and different things on the street. "How much is this one?" I ask. The man manages to get his blanket out of the wheels and stands, appraising me and everything I have before settling on his price. 50. It's a pretty steep price considering the hoop of the dream catcher is barely bigger than the palm of my hand, but I pull out my wallet. There's exactly $50 sitting there. I smile, another sign, then pass the bills over to the man. He counts and pockets the money. I have no idea what nation this man is, but instinct tells me to speak the little Mohawk I know to him. "Nyawa," I say, half a question, half an apology. "Nyo," he says, just loud enough for me to hear. Something about this small exchange feels like validation, like acceptance. We may be in totally different circumstances, but we're still a team. We both know what we're up against here, and we're surviving. After all, how many times has Mohawk even spoken on these lands today? How many land acknowledgements are mindlessly rattled off by people who don't even bother to check the pronunciation of Haudenosaunee before they start, who have no idea what the dish with one spoon treaty means, much less what it means to live by it. In a way, the two of us speaking our language together, here, now, is like traveling through time, to the days before we were trained to feel like aliens on our own lands, impediments to progress. Back to when we were worthy of holding our heads high without first needing the sort of therapy that pretends colonialism has no impact. That Jedi mind tricks of personal accountability are all we need to feel confident and okay. I'm momentarily, inexplicably filled with pure joy. I don't need to think about the cashiers or what any of them think or expect of me. I don't need to think about Steve or his academic party looming over me like a noose. That's her husband. I don't need to think about the pressure of writing a creation story that ripples outwards and helps my people. I don't need to think about anything but this one moment of connection with another Omboihomwe, possibly even another Haudenosaunee, on a busy street in the middle of a busy city where people walk fast and dismiss you faster. For a few minutes, I'm walking back home as buoyant as I left it. I'm one of my ancestors, strong, healthy, and confident, sure that I have a place in this world, a purpose. And sure enough, when I look around, it's like the concrete and buildings and pollution have disappeared. And I can see what this land would have looked like back when my people decided it was too plentiful and beautiful to belong to any one nation. That it should be a neutral zone they shared with the Anishinaabe, despite centuries of warfare and grudges. The water is clear and cold. Fish iridescent as jewels flitting through the lake and river and creeks as fast as Torontonians jet through the streets. Huge, fragrant pine needles, pine trees, and thick, almost fluffy cedar trees, and tall, skinny white birch trees with dark knots like open eyes on their bark sprout from the soft, moist brown soil, their roots as deeply attached to the earth as a breastfeeding baby is to her mother. Not Dawn to me, obviously, but another baby to a better mother. Or, yes, me, but a version of me who understands instinctively how to soothe and protect and love. The version of me I know I can become with the help of my ancestors and the shape. Suddenly, my feet are hitting concrete sidewalk again. Strangers' confused, dismissive, or judgmental looks hurtle towards me as I look down and push Dawn faster. I could feel all the confidence I felt moments before beating up on me, then dripping off like water droplets from a greasy plate. I turn down our street, and the houses around me are the houses of people who despise me, their windows flocked with expensive lace or velvet or brocade curtains that look like blinking eyes, narrowing eyes, watching and watching, judging and hating. The closest one leans in toward me, its shadow stretching over us. You don't belong here. And that's where I'll end.
Sarah, would you be better off taking that mic?
Okay.
If that's what you
Just right here?
Yeah, just a little louder.
Can you hear me? Thanks, Neva Guego. Sego Sego Guego, as Sara Ni'i, and no Wagareji as Ayuiza Hage got which way? Okay. Kiganji no hoda sorry. So Sego Sego Guego, Sara Ni'i, then no Wagareji Ayuiza Hage got Aglawana Nodase. Haudenosaunee Narratives. Deo Hahage, Sharing the River of Life, Good Wyatt's. Nick G, Jijiranto, Wagareji, Ayuiza Toga, Astoha, Angahori, Wagini, and Hoda, Kahidos, So, as was mentioned, I write a lot of different kinds of books, kids' books, speculative fiction, short stories, poems. Our company makes movies and language books, and so in trying to think about what we might talk about today, my first instinct was to go to my most recent project, which is a graphic novel about a young Ganegeha, a young man who is lost his father the year before he's about to start high school, and sort of draws on Haudenosaunee narratives to kind of navigate his way through that loss. But after our conversation, which was really nice and really helpful, I landed on something different. And as I mentioned, it's going to be from this collection of articles and stories in this book, Te Hage Sharing the River of Life, about the Tura Wampum, and that a number of my colleagues and friends wrote a piece for. So I'm going to share a little bit from that, and the section is called Storywork. It's half academic article, half creative. So you'll kind of see. I'm not a terribly academic writer. All my academic stuff comes out with something a little bit different. I formally submitted my dissertation in February 2019. I was starting to see the end of the tunnel, and I was excited to move forward. I dreamt of what I would do when I was finished. I missed writing, I missed art, I missed language, I missed my family. Anyone who has done these large, intensive research projects also knows of the sacrifices that are made for them. Those sacrifices look different for each of us, but we all make them. During the same month, my mother, who had kept a respectful distance from me during the nearly 4 years that I had been laboring over my dissertation, stopped by my house for a visit. She told me during that visit that she had been wondering, as people sometimes do, what happens after we pass away. She said she had been thinking of going somewhere, church perhaps, to ask. I asked her why she hadn't tried coming to Longhouse to learn what our ways had to say. She told me that she didn't speak the language, so she wouldn't be able to understand what they were saying. I probably don't need to tell you how this made me feel, how deeply I felt its pain, how I smiled at her, nodded understanding, but cried after she left. It wasn't my mother's fault that she didn't understand the language or know that our stories provided insight into the questions she was asking. And I realized in that moment, while I couldn't go back and change that for her, I could share what I knew, little though it may seem. I was, to be honest, a little bit embarrassed with myself for not having offered something like this to her sooner. In any case, I asked my husband if he could help me because he also knew the stories quite well, including Gaihuio, an oral tradition telling of the visions of a Seneca prophet named Handsome Lake, which I had only had a cursory understanding of. He said that he would be happy to help. A few nights later, we attended a family dinner. My parents' house is usually teeming with guests, my siblings, their children, and their grandchildren. Certainly enough people that telling any kind of story can be a challenge, especially when we all want to hear what one another has been up to. But that night, it was just me, my parents, my husband, our 2 children, and my niece, Keela. As we finished up dinner, my mother asked the question again. What happens when we leave this world? I hadn't gone there expecting to talk about it, and I had perhaps thought we would have some time to prepare what we were going to say. But there we were, and she was asking. And since I didn't know that another opportunity would present itself, I asked her if she wanted me to tell her what I had learned. And she said yes. And so, over the course of 3 hours and several pots of tea, this is the question we tried to answer, by sharing what we knew about our stories and oral traditions, and what they say about what happens when we die. We started at the earliest beginning we had, telling the story of a young woman and her brother, both born with the kind of magic referred to as Oranda, in a place called Skyworld, where a great celestial tree stood in the middle, casting its light. How when she was grown, the young woman married the chief of the Skyworld, came to be with child, and eventually made her way to a world covered in water, where one of her grandchildren would later mold our bodies from clay and breathe life into us. The versions of the stories I told that night might not have been perfect, but they were told with love. They were told with love to ease the minds and foster a sense of peace for my mother and father, the two people who had opened their lives to me and welcomed my spirit into this world. Ironically, I was mostly able to tell them because of my doctoral work, because I had chosen to read versions of the creation story, the story of the fatherless boy, and the story of the peacemaker from my research. While it was true that I'd read these texts in search of specific insights and ideas for my dissertation, descriptions of peaceful states, qualities of leadership, examples and types of collaboration, I am happy that I was able to retell them when it mattered most. The night I told my parents about our creation story and about the two paths that we encounter on Oha'atiho, the Milky Way, when we pass on, I am not sure which vessel I was drawing from more, the canoe or the ship. But I recognize that it was because of the efforts within both that I was able to tell these stories at all. I have written a lot of things and told a lot of stories through various mediums, novels, short stories, poems. But this was the most genuine and heartfelt storytelling I've ever done. I was not there to argue in favor of a particular version or to be a scholar. I was telling stories that helped to answer some of our most searching existential questions for two people I love and respect who had never had someone sit down and tell it to them before. I was there to share in and spread peace, recover and restore an interrupted line of transmission. It was the kind of storytelling that had all the gravity of a ceremony. And for all the challenge and struggle that had accompanied the completion of my doctorate, I can almost believe it was for these 3 hours alone.
That's going to be a hard act to follow. Sego's going to go, Kevin White, you got. I'm going to stand because I'm more comfortable standing than talking from a seated position. So this is an amazing panel, an amazing workshop tonight, and I think I've spent much of my career as a researcher on just the creation story. And my mentor and friend was John Mohawk, who also studied the creation story. And I'll tell a little story about it because it kind of captures this. So I had been floundering in my dissertation towards the end of my schooling. And he called me up and he's like, "You've been floundering long enough." So he goes, "What are you doing again?" And I said, "I'm doing this narrow thread of identity through creation, Great Law, and Handsome Lake." "No, that's too big." And he goes, "So you get a choice. You can do one of them." I said, "Huh." I said, "Well, I'll do Great Law." "Nope." I thought it was my choice. It is. But there's other people that are doing Great Law work that are going to do a better job than you. I was like, "Huh." I said, "How about I do Handsome Lake?" "Nope, nope, nope, nope." "Why not?" He goes, "There's not quite enough stuff for a dissertation there, but you'll have some powerful thinking to offer down the road on it." I was like, "Huh." And I said, "All right. How about I do creation?" "Now that's a good choice." And he goes, "Why don't you want to do creation?" I said, because I don't want to make my bones by debunking you and your work on creation. Who said anything about debunking my work? Well, you did. You just told me to do creation. He goes, well, I did part 2. What does that mean to you? I'm like, I don't know. Because, God, you're really having a Mohawk moment right now. You can do part 1. And that's how my trajectory on this path began. Because I'd heard the story as a kid. I went to an urban program in Rochester, New York, where I was born and raised. The version I heard as a kid was she was the daughter of Sky Woman or the guardian of the tree, and got curious and slipped through the hole. And then from the water-covered world, the turtles back, the twins of creation, everything we see around us, maybe not the concrete and steel and glass, but everything else comes from that story. And my grandfathers told me versions of it as well, growing up. And sometimes they'd say, well, that person got that wrong. But like Karl said, there's a part of that, and that's the way I think about these stories and our thinking, is that they are profound, deep ways of thinking, of engaging with the world, of engaging with each other, of engaging with other nations. And the one thing my one grandfather always said, he was from Tonawanda, he said, you know, all these stories have something in common. I said, what's that? He said, they tell us how to live and think about the world. And they also have escape hatches built in for when we really screw it up. And there's a truth in that statement. I didn't think it was at that point that poignant. But that's the point of Karl's ending, where he's learned and he's doing the best he can. And there's a moment of humility in all of that that calls on us to remember we as humans are not the pinnacle of all of creation. We're not the pinnacle of human civilization throughout history. We are in fact the weakest and most forgetful. Everything else that was put on this earth was put here deliberately to aid us in our existence, to cause us to remember our responsibilities to each other and to the natural world. And in that kind of context, that came from both research, but thinking and hearing about these stories, and realizing I really loathe the term classic mythology. Because for me, myth denotes something unbelievable or untrue. And it's not. These are epistemologies. These are ways of thinking about the world. As Grandpa said, with escape hatches built in for when we forget and screw up. And what I find fascinating about all these kinds of stories is that, yes, we write now, but what is writing? Is writing not just a group of symbols that mean something to somebody? So is a wampum belt not a form of writing? Are pictographs and drawings on bark not a form of writing? If a symbol means something to you and you can tell a story from it, that's what we're supposed to do. Why? Because we connect as people through stories. But our Western folks around here sometimes think, well, we can't rely on these stories because time immemorial is something that's unimaginable to us. Because, you know, the fish is going to be this big, and a few months later it's going to be this big, and, you know, 10 years from now it's going to be this big, and 20 years from now it's Moby Dick. But there's essences of things, and this is the brilliance that comes out of the stories and out of the ways of thinking about this for me, is that there are core knowledge systems and value systems at play. I want you to think about this in this context for really one quick second. Whether we all agree or disagree that the globe is changing right now, environmentally or not, climate change or not, what values are we teaching the next generation and the next 5 generations after that? Do we know what they're going to face? Because I want you to think about 7 generations ago. Let's just argue a simple number, 150 years ago. Do you think those folks imagined where we were today? Think about how big your cell phones were 10, 20 years ago. Think about how small they become. Think about how powerful they become. So we don't know what the future is going to hold in 100, 150 years. But we can instill those values through the stories. And I also think, as somebody that does a lot of the academic research and trying to recover this, and as my friend Sue Gould told me, she's like, you're kind of re-Ungwe-hoing this stuff because you're trying to extract, which is exactly what John did, tried to extract out the Victorian age thinking, the Western ideals, because as much as I champion Hewitt, he was writing for that readership. He wasn't writing for us, but he preserved it for us. And so did those knowledge keepers. And so they had that forethought because it was the midst of residential schooling. You know, I haven't started my language journey yet, in part because I had a visceral reaction to my father's, who was never a very emotionally charged man, but he had a meltdown when he learned me to count to 10 in Mohawk. And it would be at his death that we found out he was a fluent speaker. Or at least a very engaged speaker. But he also went to the Mushholder Mohawk Institute. And my great-grandmother went to Carlisle. And a student in one of my courses helped me to change my thinking, and I'll leave my final thought with you on this. We need to stop thinking about things in terms of decades and centuries ago. We need to think about generations ago and generations forward. Because I'm only 1 and 3 generations removed from residential school. Most Indigenous families, if not every single one of them, have been altered and changed forever by residential schooling. I'm hopeful and grateful because the language work that's going on in all our communities right now, I wasn't sure I'd see in my lifetime. And I know that there's a lot of scholars, including some of the people I admire here in this room, that cracked those ceilings, and then some of us have been out doing this work. But these next generation of scholars that are language speaking, part of our communities, part of our ceremonial way of life, are going to be fierce academics. And it's not just decolonization and some of the other fancy words that our colleagues here have learned to use. It's all about it all. And so that's why I wrestle with this kind of stuff and try to think about it in those deep, deep ways. And then I'll end with one final note. I never intended to get a PhD, but I did it because of my 7th grade teacher. And not in a good way. He came in and the first thing he said to us, and again, I knew enough of our culture and for my grandfathers and from the community programs I went to, he walked in and said, we're gonna learn about a group of cannibals that lived here in New York State. I kind of disagreed with him, and somehow a book kind of magically flew the air towards him in his general direction. But what stung was when he whispered to my mother and I in the guidance counselor's office, no one else around to hear, I have a PhD in history, I know more about your people than you do. The greatest irony of it all, he's now my biggest fan. He's like, you know so much. And I'm like, yeah, and I haven't changed since 7th grade because I trusted my elders, my grandfathers, my communities. And that's the efforts that we have to put in, but we also have to let go of that, some of those traumas and victimizations of it. I just find it humorous now that he's like, you know so much. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah, wait.
Okay, now I don't know how to follow any of that. We had this, we've been talking about it a little bit, but a session the other night, and one of the things we talked about are like the core threads. And one of the core threads that I'm hearing, like just sitting here, is language. And my son went for a walk, but he was here, but the only language that I could pass on to him, so if I were to call him up, like he can count to 10 in Mohawk, because that's the one thing that I passed on to him. And it may seem minor to some people, but that's really important to me. And my dear student here, who you heard from earlier, Jasmine Rice, has been, will be doing, I can't remember the name of the program, but I'm going to say Mohawk Immersion Program this year, and has sort of like planted seeds for me. There's like a bit of hesitation. I don't know what that is, but I feel very moved by this conversation to, you know, what is stopping me from that journey, so I can pass more on to my children. But I'm going to, I guess I'm going to, there's so many things that just came up, but maybe bring it back. I wanted this to, I think we all talked about this being like an organic conversation, so I don't have set questions, but one of the things is thinking, you know, here we are gathered on, you know, Dish with One Spoon territory, and Some of you may have recognized the rendition of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell in the lobby when you came in. You had mentioned, Dr. White, you had mentioned the creation story and sort of everything that we see. And I'm looking out the window as you're talking, right? But you said, but not the buildings and the glass windows. And so I was thinking of that, right? Like here we are in Dish with One Spoon territory, and this is what we see. I'm going to, and maybe that'll prompt some thoughts for conversation, but I wanted to read this from Alicia Elliott's first book, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground. And it kind of goes back to that, like, what does it mean to be Haudenosaunee here and gathered here on Dish with One Spoon territory, or to be Indigenous in the city in Toronto. So it's interesting reading your words as you're sitting right beside me. But here we go. No trace of Indigenous history is etched into these sidewalks, illuminated by these street lights, cemented between those bricks. Not when I lived here years ago, and not today. That past is still packed up, forgotten. Descendants of this land's original caretakers are still here, though. We're laughing with our friends outside the movie theater, or trying to get by selling dream catchers at Lawrence Spadina, or dancing in our regalia at the tiny but perfect powwow at Dufferin Grove Park, or reading on the subway on the way to school. We are here in diaspora on our own lands. I'm gonna stop there, and I'm just gonna pass this around.
I'll let you guys go first.
I'll give my fellow colleagues some time to think. So I used to work in the city for 7 years. I worked for an organization called the Chiefs of Ontario. And it was really lovely because I got the chance to travel across Turtle Island, and I visited a lot of communities during that time. And I feel like part of what, like language has always been really with me. My undergrad was in English. I took a lot of critical theory classes and as part of my honors BA. And a lot of the dialogue in those classes was like, that English is the language of the colonizer. And so always, like since I was little, I knew I wanted to write stories. But once I hit university and really understood the theft of our languages, I knew that I would have to, I wanted to, reclaim that for myself. And I think just little pieces along the way sort of led me there. And I think that's how, a part of it happens, or that's how it happened to me. And in my work with language revitalization, thinking of jazz, I'm really excited. I work at Six Nations Polytech, which is, I think, where you're studying, right, in the Bachelor's of Arts at Omohoi Languages. Which is something I worked on when I finally left the Chiefs of Ontario. I went to Six Nations Polytechnic and I wrote that degree. So it's really it's for me that has always been about making sure there was a lot of things out there where people could follow that trail back wherever it was. Whether it was an app, that's something that we made at Six Nations Polytechnic for Gaikono and Ganiegeha. Whatever it is, whatever idea somebody has, I can get really excited about wanting to work on, so that it can reach you even if you're not in the ancestral lands, for example, along the Finger Lakes, if you're here in Jitgarundo, if you're in an urban setting and trying to reconnect and you want to hear that, because I do believe that our languages have and hold power. I 100% believe that. And I think that even though when I told my mom that story, I used English a lot to explain it to her, I knew that had power too. And what I liked about our conversation the other day was this idea of our Haudenosaunee literatures mean a lot of different things to me any given day. This week, they're very connecting, grounding literatures, and that they can help me cross a distance with her. And now that was in 2019, it's 2024 now. I have a younger sister who's married to Jen's cousin, and she's a really great Ganiegeha speaker. And through her, she was a big influence on me. My parents have also reclaimed a lot of language just from us. So I really like that idea that and I learned a lot of that from our elders traveling around, whether they were in the Anishinaabe territory or out west, saying every assembly that the Chiefs of Ontario had, or Assembly First Nations, they have their problems, right? These types of organizations. But they did make space for elders, and basically every time those elders spoke, they said, theorize from your creation stories and learn your language. And like every single break, every single time they spoke, that's what I heard for 7 years. And so I was like, yep, the second I'm done here, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do my best. And that was 12 years ago. That was 14 years ago. It took me 12 years to leave the Six Nations Polytechnic and take an adult immersion program where I think I saw like the majority of my language growth. So it is a journey, and I feel like having whatever it is, whether it's stories, like you read Alicia's book and you see that there, and you're like, yeah, like that's meaningful for me to see Ganiegeha in this book that has won awards, and like, yay, yes, like I want that for our kids, whatever it is. And I think books are such a fabulous way to kind of reach out to people. So I'm really grateful for your stories and for your work too. So that's maybe some of my thinking about Jitgarundo, what it means to be like in different places on Turtle Island.
I think that's a great point. I can riff off a little bit. Because I grew up in Rochester, which is a much smaller city. I actually began to call Buffalo home while I was there as a grad student because it was a new life experience where I was really kind of re-immersing myself in our communities. But I also grew up in Geneseo, New York, one of the original traditional Seneca villages that has a long and complex and complicated history. And what was fascinating about it is in some ways I'm still kind of that kid that grew up in the country. And so while I moved here in 2019 and was surrounded by all this concrete and steel, I think I'm probably one of the outliers that can say one of the things COVID allowed was for me to do a lot of deep thinking, but also to wander the city early in the morning. Because, as Rick Hill would say, that was a bad country song. It was dating somebody she broke up with me days before COVID. I lost my puppy, dog of 11 years, a few days into COVID. I had a close friend that we maintained contact because we were both up here. And shared meals and stuff like that. But it was a chance to walk the city in the morning because I couldn't sleep anymore. But I also did sleep a lot. I think I've gained a lot of sleep back from the 17 years of sleep I lost in Oswego. But there's still parts of Oswego that I miss in the sense, if you don't know where it is, it's literally on the other side of the lake from here. And it's got one of the most gorgeous sunsets in the world to me. It's also a place of fierceness in terms of wind and surf. And I was talking this over with a friend the other day. He's like trying to help me visualize a great writing spot. And he goes, I want you to think about this stuff. And I told him, I said, I used to sit in my truck and stare at that lake, have a cup of coffee, and don't tell anybody, smoke my cigar. And I said, then I get out of the car and I go down the lake shore and hear that wind roaring around me. And sometimes feel that mist of the water from crashing on the rocks. And I said it was almost magical because it was deafening. And then I'd walk just 30 meters and be next to this still pond in the midst of all these woods on the edge of campus. And it was like a dome of silence that dropped over it because you could hear the birds singing. You could hear the squirrels chittering and other even insects. And yet I was on the edge of campus, you could hear the cars, but it was muted. You could hear the students talking between classes, but it was muted. And he goes, that's your spot. He goes, visualize writing there. He goes, drop a desk right there. And he goes, when you get stuck on writing, think about that. I'll be dipped if it didn't work. And all of this is that the natural world reflects a lot back to us. I don't know if anybody's ever told most people in this room, but I can be a grumpy old guy. Very grumpy. I'm prematurely grumpy.
I think they believe you.
They probably do. But in that way, if you've ever gone for a walk in the woods, I remember being just really surly one day. I knew I wasn't good to be around. So I walked out and I was working at Ganondagan State Historic Site. I didn't even have to have Pete or Mike or anybody else tell me. Grab some clippers, go start cleaning the trail. I just walked down into the woods. And then it was an eerie silence, but not a good kind of silence. And so I sat down and stilled myself And then very slowly, I heard a tentative chirp. Then another tentative chirp. And then slowly life came back together around me. And all it took was one movement from me, and everything went dead silence again. Now, I'm not always just grumpy, even though I love to portray it that way. I went out a couple days later, I got from me to Karl away from a doe who didn't hear me, jumped, must have been 30 feet away from me, turned around and just looked at me, and the tail was like, and I don't speak deer, but I know that deer was mad at me. And so, but that's the power of the natural world. You can learn a lot of lessons from it if you open yourself up to it, which is what our stories are about. The other thing I love are dogs. People know that I've had dogs for probably close to 30 years now. And what I love about them is they're also the perfect mirror. I had a black lab that used to just sit and, when I was in a grumpy mood, he'd just sit from the other room and watch me through the living room going, yeah, I'm gonna stay here on the couch. But he turned out to be my best writing buddy for 10 years. He had a whole dramatic thing I'll say for another time, but there is this kind of way of thinking about, and now I should say, my wife and I live in Paris, so I'm back in kind of a country setting, and I get to walk along the Grand River, you know, daily. And it's a small little, Ontario's best little town, I guess. Don't come now, we're digging everything up though for some reason. But in that way, it's nice to be back there because I hear the birds. I could do without the mosquitoes, but there's a story for them too. So there's power in these stories, and there's ways of thinking about life. So I'm gonna end there.
I have a deer story too. I'll tell it later.
I have a deer story too. Should we all just tell deer stories? Okay, mine's real quick. I'll just tell right now. So I was, this is back when I was living in Mentor, Ohio, and we had like, it was weird. We were living in a rental house, and there was like this, the property, even though it was like, it was like a normal street in a city, but behind my house, for some reason, it just went all the way back. There was like woods, there was a creek back there where like, you know, sometimes if you were like really lucky, you would see like a blue heron just like perched in the creek. And so obviously there was like woods. And I remember one time coming out into my living room, and we had this big window onto our lawn. And like I just came out, and there was like a whole family of deer just on our lawn, and they were just they were just standing there, and I was just like, oh my God, like what do we do? We're just staring at these deer. Like what do? You just stare at them, right? Like that's just your new thing. You just stare. Like they're the television. Like oh my God, I think they moved. And like, you know, just like one of them's eating grass, you know, so like we just stayed and watched, and like eventually, you know, because it was still a street. So like someone drives by, scares them, they run away. But it was just pretty amazing. I don't know, like one of those things that I think those moments bring you back to yourself and bring you back to, you know, remembering where you are within the creation and that you're part of it and not oppositional to it, as you know, so many Western mindsets would think. You know, like I think a lot about the fact that in terms of storytelling, when I was in high school, I remember, or even in college, they were talking about the different adversarial ways that humans were. It was of different types of conflict. It's human versus human, or like man versus man versus nature.
Man versus himself.
Yeah, man versus himself. And I remember being like, what? Like, that's weird, you know what I mean? And yet that was like being taught to all of us as we're just like, as though it was just natural that we're always adversarial to nature. And, you know, thinking about all of the, like, I've just been reading a lot of nature writing because I'm supposed to be teaching a course on writing nature. And so I've been reading a lot of these things, and there's this book that I just picked up, and it's meant to be a book for people to learn how to write about nature. And it's interesting because they had a chapter, it was written by these two white guys, and I was like, I was like, we'll see. And they have like a chapter that's the history of environmental writing. And it was so weird because there was one part where they were like, imagine you're one of the settlers who comes to North America, you're scared of everything, and there's these scary exactly. It was crazy. It was like they were like, and you're scared of of the animals, of of all of the trees around you, and the native people. And then the next sentence was even more wild. It was like, and all of these things often lead to individuals and whole communities dying. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, cite your sources. What's happening? And it was just like there, and I was just like, what's going on? You know what I mean? Like this, and it always comes back to me when I'm thinking about how people write about nature and how they think of it as, oh look, I like nature. I'm different than the other people, instead of just like, no, this is just how we should be in the world, right? And that stories are, I like to bring it back around to kind of stories, there are so many stories that continue that kind of tradition of, man versus nature, and in brackets also native people. Like, that's supposed to be how we write about the world and the way that we live in the world, and what it would mean to be like that. We don't need that. Like, that's not necessary. We didn't have it for so long. And the idea that like history started when lands were settled is also a story that I think we need to be pushing back against, because the history of land is not dependent on humans, but we are dependent on the land. And I think that's what we always need to come back to as we're doing all of these things, moving in our lives. We don't need to be here. And like, the land can keep going. A lot of the animals and the plants and all of these different things, the bacteria, everything, it'll keep going. And that's actually something that like brings me joy. Actually, when I get nervous about like all of the things that are happening, is I'm like, even when we're not here, there's going to be something is going to live. And like, that brings me peace, knowing that. So anyway.
And like now, Karl, for your opening, because I feel like the way Karl spoke about it to me is very much how many of our stories are, right? Like, they put us in context with creation, and kind of over and over again, like you have that, but you can obviously fall out of context and like forget yourself, and you're not required, I think, to be a perfect human. And that's, I think, what's nice about nature too, is I think it kind of stands by you even as you're going through these different weathers. And my deer story was like, I never ever see deer, but when you come down the escarpment in Hamilton, like there's always deer on this thing. And my mom was like excellent at like sighting them. She always saw them and I never did. And on the very first day of my applying for my Chiefs of Ontario job, I saw one. And on my very last day, I saw one.
Oh,
and for me, it was just interesting. Like, I never ever saw them. For 7 years, I didn't see them. And then all of a sudden, you do. And I almost feel like in that way, like nature kind of like, it like can speak through to you. Like if it, you maybe don't always see it, but like it can kind of be there with you when you're making these different changes and doing these different things. And I feel like language kind of has a way of doing that too. And when you were talking about like nature writing, who's really great at that is Robert McFarlane. He's got a lot of really cool books. And he quotes this other person, I don't know, I always worry when I tell their quotes of other people, because I don't know, maybe they've done something terrible in the time since I read it. Like, you shouldn't think about them this way. But he quotes this American farmer, Wendell Berry, who says like, you defend what you particularly love, and you love what you particularly know. And for me, I think like reclaiming that relationship with land and language, using language, being out, seeing it, letting it be there for us when we're trying to do like our writing or our life's work or our spirit's work, I feel like is really important. So I always really like him like dropping that, and I felt like it's very in alignment with kind of how Karl had led us off with thinking about context and putting ourselves in context alongside creation.
Okay. I was just doing a time check because I know we're kind of nearing the end, but I do have, this might be a big question. I don't know if it's questions so much, but just picking up on what you had both said, and I'm going to misquote you, but I think you were talking about like the way of living in the world. you said something like that. And then you defend what you love and you know you love what you know. Yeah, okay. So as we're having this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about Ellen Gabrielle and Sean Carlton's book, When the Pine Needles Fall. Some of you may know that July 11th, so I think it was July 11th, Sunday, I don't know. But anyways, that was 35 years after the siege of Ganasatake and Ganawage, otherwise what some people understand as the Oka crisis. And in that book is written in conversation between settler and allied historian Sean Carlton from the University of Manitoba and Ellen Gabrielle from Ganawage, who was known as the spokesperson behind the barricades. But I'm thinking of this like for a couple of reasons, like what does it mean to live in the world? Well, we're all Haudenosaunee, so we come from a matrilineal community, and some of these kind of like conversations about like, you know, man versus man or man, all of that, right? It's like, well, that doesn't align with a Haudenosaunee or a matrilineal worldview. But in that book, there's this, I guess this is what I wanted to get to. Ellen Gabrielle is sharing about the story that should have been told about what is referred to as the Oka crisis, but what she adamantly reminds us is actually the siege of Ganawage and Ganasatake, was the protection of the Great Pines. And she says the pines are actually the oldest Haudenosaunee community, that area, and are written into the Great Law of Peace. And I think that this is so powerful and in different ways comes up in the way you bring Haudenosaunee stories into your work, has to do with the protection against the racialized, sexualized, and gender-based violences against Indigenous women. And so I'm gonna get tongue-tied here, but so maybe I won't say the word, but she's talking about like when the missionaries came 3 centuries ago, and the women actually went out into the pines for protection. So the pines was historically a site of refuge. And in a reciprocal way, in 1990, you know, as Haudenosaunee women, the role of women as land defenders and water protectors, that's just part of the roles and responsibilities of Haudenosaunee women. But it was a reciprocal act to then go back and protect the pines. And so there's a lot of like deep layered meaning into that, you know, and the untold story, the story that should have been told, right? So think about the erasure of Indigenous women. We were talking about literature earlier, right? And you know, the erasure of Indigenous women in literature, the erasure of Indigenous women at the front lines in what's referred to as the Oka crisis. I don't know if that's a question, but I think that in both of your works, you have these stories that go back to how Haudenosaunee, and go back even to Creation Story, how that is about the rightful place of women in our communities and the protection of Indigenous women.
Yeah. Did you want to? No, you can. You go first, and then I'm happy to.
Oh, sure. If you wanted to. Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah. I guess that kind of reminds me of when I was in high school. There was another land, a land issue, I guess, or to Canadians and corporations, but it was a land reclamation, and it was actually started by women as well. And there were meetings with women where they were planning where they were going to start this, because they knew that they did all of this research and they had talked, they knew how Canada operated. And I talk about this a little bit in A Mind Spread on the Ground, but basically the Canadian government has essentially said that if there are homes on land and people have moved into them, Canadians have moved into them, they are not going to negotiate those lands back. And that, of course, means that every single time that there is a land development that is starting, that is encroaching on Six Nations land, all around Six Nations, They could have picked any number of places. That means that once those people move in, they can't negotiate the land back, even if they know that they have the documentation that says this is not your land. If you only had it for like this many years and then you have not renegotiated any sort of agreement or anything like that. I guess I don't want to be too negative about it, but I do think that it is worth noting that, the thing that makes me sad about thinking about that time is that the women who were the spokespeople of the land reclamation in Caledonia at what they called Douglas Creek Estates, what we had called Ganasado, were Dawn Hill and Jeannie Jameson, I believe. And they did so much for our community, and they were always there to talk to reporters. They were always there to talk to police. They were making sure that people were safe and all of those things. And like it just ran them down eventually, and they had to stop and step away. And maybe this is a sad note to kind of end on, but I do think that, women can do all of these things. And we have often been put in situations where we have to, and we just have to keep going, and no one is there to take the load off. And then, in fact, they're only there to add more loads when you already have enough. But I think that, when we're thinking about women's responsibilities, we also should be thinking about the fact that just because women can do all of these things doesn't mean that they should, and that we need to also, as communities, step up and not continue putting more loads and more loads and more loads on women who already often have more than enough that they're carrying, I guess. So anyways.
Yeah, Nyala for that, and Nyala for that question. I feel like I didn't bring a lot of my work, but as you can see, or if you ever see my work, you'll see that I'm constantly painting women and thinking about Indigenous women's experiences and Haudenosaunee women specifically. Obviously, I grew up in Six Nations, very lacrosse strong. I love lacrosse. I grew up basically in the GPA arena, and it's the first place I really experienced racism and really heard us be called all of these names that we are not supposed to say. Around 9 or 10, I was like, what is that? What is a savage? Who are these people that they're talking about? And as Alicia was saying, a lot of my reading through high school and into university privileged a certain lens. So one of the first times I heard of Hiawatha was the story of Hiawatha from, was it Wordsworth? William, yeah, so not Jake Thomas or somebody else well seasoned to speak about that. And so I also, though, as I was reading a lot of the stories of our men, which they're really great stories, like this guy who Levi General, those are really important stories to read. But I was hearing them a lot, and when I hear people kind of tell those stories, they often choose Tadadaho and Hiawatha, that's the story that they want to tell. And so when I was working for Chiefs of Ontario, and right before they were starting to do land acknowledgements, we would be inundated with calls saying, okay, well, I'm going to Winnipeg, who should I thank? I'm going to Thunder Bay, who should I acknowledge? And one time I got a call that was well, I'm going to Niagara Falls, who are the traditional peoples of that area? This is 2010 for me. I'm okay, I better go, I don't know. I'm gonna go find out. And as I was doing kind of research on this, I found out that I was introduced to Jikon, the first clan mother, and I had never heard of this woman. I had not known her story. I had not heard her story. But as I went to research her more and really understand who she was, she's definitely in J.N.D.B. Hewitt's Concerning the League, or John Arthur Gibson, my apologies, John Arthur Gibson's Concerning the League. But I would find all these random, and she's in some Jesuit relations stuff too. I would find some random notes about her, and they would be really crazy stuff. Oh, she was this beautiful Indian maiden who got married, and then they took away her title of Peace Queen because they couldn't trust her anymore. And I was what is this? And a lot of times you're writing because you have to respond, right? my husband and I were just in chapters the other day, and we found a really bad rendition of our creation story. I was like, oh God, this is our next book right here, creation story. It's coming. And a lot of times you're responding to that, right? And restorying what I understood of women, because even though I didn't find their stories in the text, I saw them everywhere in my community doing the work that Alicia is talking about. I saw them running our organizations, I saw them starting businesses, I saw them doing policy work, teaching at universities, raising children, holding down ceremony, like just so many things. And so in like some of the art that I'm doing that I brought, it's like showing women and the Tree of Peace and showing them kind of back in these places, continuing into this work and doing the work of what I understood Jacobson to be doing, right, is to helping uphold the peace. And I think that we're all kind of doing that, right? And that's just kind of the happy place where I landed, is that we all get a chance to honor the two-row and to honor the treaties and honor the dish with one spoon and to kind of bring ourselves into alignment. And even though a lot of the other things about why we have to do that are really tiring, that part is powerful and sometimes just really fun. And so I'm really grateful that like we're doing it.
Meowing for that. Thank you. And that's actually in the story and how you came to know, I'm going to mispronounce it, but Jacobson more intimately,
Yeah.
like is in here. And so I didn't read one of your quotes, but
I didn't read the book either, so I'll just trust that it's
it is in here. I think, I know we're kind of like heading towards the end, and Jasmine, you've collected some of the questions, so maybe, maybe we'll kind of shift.
Yeah.
Do you want me to share it? I'll also just share, in case you missed it, we have some cue cards and pens near the entrance, so we can come around and pass them around similar. If you had a question, just ask you that you write it on the cue card and we'll come collect it to ask the panelists. So the first one says, a mind spread out on the ground is such vulnerable story work which resonates and transcends the very core of my being every time I read the essays. Thank you for sharing your talent and gift of writing with all of us, with me. And the question is, do you have any wisdom you can share on how to write about trauma in a way that focuses on the call to action more than the trauma itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've answered this question before, so because I've thought about this a lot. And one of the things that I like to share is before I wrote A Mind Spread on the Ground, I remember I was living in Brantford. I traveled to Toronto because Katerina Vermette was at U of T, and this was when the break was coming out. And so I was like, I gotta go and see her. And so I went in this tiny little room at U of T, and someone asked a similar question to her about that. And I was really eager to hear what she had to say. And if you've read The Break, it's a beautiful book, but there's an act of terrible violence against a young Indigenous woman that is at the center of the book. And the book is kind of structured around that. And when someone asked Katerina what how she approached that, she said basically that like she knew she had to write it. She had to write it because it was the center of the book. It would be a hole if it wasn't there. But that she didn't want to do it because, I mean, yes, they're fictional characters, but we're putting ourselves mentally in those spaces as we're describing what's happening. In words and causing images in our heads, all of these things, right? And she said that when she had to sit down to do it, that she got in and got out as quickly as possible. And I thought about that a lot, and it made me think a lot about what role does trauma play? What is it that draws us to trauma, or what is it that we get from trauma? And there are obviously like weirdos who like to like voyeuristically look at people in pain, and they're like, I don't know, they've got weird stuff around that. I don't want to talk about that, I guess. But but I think that most people, when they're going through something very difficult or they have gone through something very difficult, it's not that you are happy that that has happened to you, even if you have been able to turn it into something good. It's that it's not that that was what was important. It was how you responded to that, how that affected you, how you were able to sit in that and make a choice about how you would move forward from that trauma. And so one of the things that I always talk about is like, if you have to show trauma, I think getting in and getting out very quickly is a good method. But also, do you really have to show it? Because to me, I always feel like the important thing is not the traumatic act itself. It is, like I said, what you get from the trauma. And so, sometimes that could look different ways if you want how you want to represent it on a page. It could be, I'm going to show you what I was like before this happened and what I was like after. And then you can see how that affected me, because that's the important thing. And then how I moved from there, because that's the important thing. And so it's important to think about what it is about the trauma that you feel you need to hone in on to write. And then that will help you figure out how to write it. What are the important things to draw from it, and then what to depict from there. And so, yeah, I think that that's something that I feel very strongly about, is that you don't have to. There are people who will say, you have to. Like, I've had editors who are like, well, you left this out, you didn't show this. I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't intend to show that. That's not going to happen. It's never been something someone has asked me, is like, what really happened there? No one has ever asked that, because they know as they read that that's not the important thing. And the people who think that is the important thing need to really think about what it is that they are actually looking for, and whether that's how they get it or not, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of blend a couple of questions together to try and hit as many as possible. So do you think these stories are sacred? If so, what does that mean to you? I imagine stories referring to like creation story and whatnot. And then part two is, how do colonizers appreciate Indigenous values, language, teachings, and stories without causing more damage and appropriation when attempting to use them?
Yeah.
I think those are some great questions, and it ties in some really interesting points for me that begin to kind of come full circle. So I forget who mentioned Jake Thomas, but I kind of always have loved his quote where he said, "There are no experts in Haudenosaunee culture. We come together and put our minds on the table, and if you have something I need to borrow, I can borrow. If I have something you need to borrow, you can borrow it." And that's different than there's always a right and there's always a wrong answer, black and white. But I also think about it in this way of how these stories come out about traumatic events and how we deal with that. And I think there's a couple things that jumped out to me from the creation story. So basically the twins of creation that create this natural world around us. One is a healthy-minded twin or good-minded twin, and the other one's Flint, or for me, an unhealthy-minded twin. He's angry, he lives in fear a lot, he hoards, and both he and Sky Woman, who is the grandmother of the twins, treat the good-minded twin terribly. And so his father, in some of the versions it's Turtle Man, and some Seneca versions it's West Wind. Turtle Man comes to Good Mind, I usually prefer Sapling, calling him Sapling. He says, your grandmother and brother are treating you terribly. Why don't you just leave them be? Or walk away from them and don't help them anymore? And he says, because I will right their minds again one day. They're doing this and I'll restore them. So that's creation. The mother of all nations. The first clan mother. her mind wasn't right either. And it was the peacemaker in Ayanwentha that came to her and counseled her and restored her mind again. And in that, she was the one that comes up with a song that soothes Tadadaho so that it can begin to right his body and comb the snakes from his hair. So there's redemption in all of these stories. There's a way to come back into balance with the natural world, with each other as humans. And on a different animal note, I'll share one other thing. Don't ever think the natural world won't scold you sometimes too. And teach you a very harsh lesson. I had only been here a few months. What is now this school over here, I don't even know what, I guess it's part of the Toronto City School District or something like that. They built it really quickly while I was living over in housing over here. Came out one morning, and I've always been fascinated by red-tailed hawks. I think they're beautiful. I had never heard one sing. I didn't know they sang. And there he was, sitting on the top of the crane. It was sunrise. I told you I got up early. And he was singing. I came out, I'm just staring at it because I've never heard it sing before. He stops somewhere in the middle of a song and just goes. And I'm like, okay. I'm looking for it. But he starts singing again. Look back up. And then it connected for me. Because in the story of creation, sapling scoops up earth and breathes life into it. And from between his fingers, all the birds of the world fly. And this goes back to their original instructions. They are to sing to cheer us up, to raise our minds up off the ground. They also sing the elder brother, the sun, into the sky every day. And because I felt a little scolded, I was a little sheepish after that. A couple days later it came and there was a red-tailed wing feather stuck right in the dirt right next to my truck door. I was like, okay, cool, we're good, Uncle. I'm happy again. But this is, if we're open to it, we have to listen to the natural world. Let it teach us because there are elder brothers. They were created before us to cause us to remember our responsibilities, which is the words that come before our else. We're supposed to give thanks and greetings, acknowledgement every day, both when we gather, but as individuals. And I don't have time to go into it, but I was working on the corn project with John one time, and he goes, why are you so interested in this? You've been a cook, you live in the city, why are you so interested in white corn? I said, because I don't get corn soup often enough. And second, I said, I'm still that little kid that likes watching the sprout from the egg cup. And if you look at it with a wonderment and awe, you can't help but be amazed. And at the end, this good mind, 2 generations ago, they called it a contented mind, being satisfied, being content. And that's powerful thinking. That's the value system that's meant to be passed down through the generations, through stories. Doesn't mean we can't imprint on it. Doesn't mean we can't tweak it a little bit. It does mean we have to push back against some of the Western folks that say, well, look at, William Fenton is my nemesis. If you're a grad student here, you need an intellectual nemesis to go at. Mine was William Fenton. I was going to spend my career debunking all the crap he wrote. And John very harshly put it into perspective one day. He goes, we may need somebody to do that, but it can't be you. I'm like, why not? I've got the energy, drive, and meanness. He goes, because you're not a very good writer. That's it. Ouch. He goes, he has a legion of students and colleagues that will sit there and shred everything you do because you didn't put the comma in the right place. He goes, they won't see what you're actually thinking about. They'll just shred you because you're not a... And then I discovered when I was working with all the languages of the Hewitt works that maybe my brain wasn't so far off, because in English we say, you and I are going to go to the store. But if you look at some of the language work, and I'm really novice at this, it actually is like, to store we go. And I'm like, that's how I write. And he goes, yeah, it's not proper English though. I say, at least it's hardwired into my head then. So I'll end on that note. Yeah.